Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar from Risk-Based Security. Over the next 30 to 45 minutes, we're going to be digging into the latest statistics on the data breach landscape, looking at what we've learned from 2019 and what we can expect in 2020. We will have quotable statistics, nerdy charts, and all the bullet points you could possibly want. But before we get to the good stuff, my name is Brendan Dodds, and it's with great pleasure that I share with you the housekeeping information for today's session. The recording of today's session will be made available on BrightTalk and on our website, so do bookmark this link and share it with your friends and enemies alike. This is the first in a new series of webinars focused on the latest trends and issues in data breaches and vulnerabilities. And we don't want you to miss out, so please take a moment to subscribe to the Risk-Based Security channel on BrightTalk. Now, we love to hear from you. We want your questions, so do post them in the box provided. We'll address some of them as we go and pause for Q&A at the end of the session as well. If you are watching the replay or you need to get in touch with us for any other reason, you can do so via the contact page on our website at riskbasedsecurity.com/contact. The analysis you're going to hear today is based on our newly released 2019 year-end Data Breach QuickView report. And that report is available to you to download at no cost with no strings attached. Webinar registrants can download it from the content section right here in BrightTalk. And if you're watching the replay or you can't see it for any reason, you can find the report and further analysis on emerging data breach trends on our website, riskbasedsecurity.com. My name is Brendan Dodds and I'm the Director of Marketing here at Risk-Based Security, but don't worry, it is time to hand you over to someone who really knows what she's talking about. Today's session will be led by Inga Goddijn, Executive Vice President, Risk-Based Security. Now, Inga found her way to information security after around 20 years in the insurance industry, where she witnessed firsthand the impact of ineffective security program management and, of course, the financial fallout from significant data breach events. At Risk-Based Security, she's responsible for our cyber risk analytics and your CISO products, and it is my pleasure to hand you over to Inga, who's going to take us through today's agenda. Inga.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Brendan, and thank you everyone for tuning in today for our discussion. As Brendan said, my name is Inga, and I'm so glad that you could join us today. For today's session, as Brendan said, we will be going through all those nerdy charts as well as some bonus content as well for folks that are tuning in today. So special for everybody who's listening in. We'll hit all the highlights. We'll hit some of the lowlights as well because 2019 was a pretty rough year. But we're also going to talk about what made it such a rough year. So some of the factors that drove the numbers, some of the things that influence what we're seeing in our statistics. And as we go through those numbers, some of the things that we're going to pay particular attention to is compromise of email systems, not necessarily to be confused with business email compromise, although they are perhaps two sides of the same coin, but a specific focus on actual unauthorized access to email accounts and how that influenced our numbers. Of course, we'll be taking a look at ransomware because no discussion of 2019 or looking into 2020 would be complete without visiting the evil that is ransomware that's out there right now. And then we've included some fun analysis of a password leak just to change things up a little bit. So we'll include that in our conversation as well. And as we go through, we'll be discussing some of the lessons learned from 2019. And then as we wrap things up today, we'll take a quick look at what to expect into 2020. So with that said, let's dig into our nerdy charts, which I happen to love. Thank you very much. And we'll start right at the very beginning. So how many breaches were there in 2019? Well, we captured 7,098 data breach events in 2019, which is up just about 1% compared to 2018. So certainly on the surface, it looks like things might have steadied and leveled out there a little bit. Although I do think it is worthwhile to share that we are anticipating 2019 to end up anywhere between another 350, maybe 450 events being reported.
Inga, let me jump in for a second.
Yeah.
What explains the additional 300 to 400 breaches that we're expecting to see here?
Yeah, that is a great question. And it's really, I think an important place to start actually with our talk today is it's always good to dig into what these dates or what these numbers actually mean. So as we're looking at our 7,000 some odd breaches, and what we're talking about with breach events reported in 2019 is the actual number of events that first came to light during 2019. Or in other words, the news of the event first left the four walls of the organization during 2019. And as anybody who's worked in or worked with data breach events for any time, you know that there's a lot of different date windows that you can look at when analyzing a breach. There's the date the event actually occurred, the date of the first date of unauthorized access. There's the oh no, Houston, we have a problem moment when the organization actually discovers that they've had a breach. Then there's the date that the organization might have reported it, or the date that it first becomes knowledge when they post it on their website, that sort of thing. So all of our data in our report really focuses around that reported on date, or that date of first public disclosure. And it always takes a little bit of time for the data to settle and for the data to congeal, for events to become confirmed over time. I am pretty confident that we will end up around that 350, 450 number. Just for the sake of a little bit of comparison, in 2018 for the year-end report, when we published that report, we were at 6,515 events for 2018. And you can see here on the chart, we ended up at 7,000. And that's a pretty consistent rate of addition to the breach events over time. So that's where we're going. But of course, the number of events is just one piece of the puzzle. You flip that over on the opposite side, and you look at the number of records exposed in the year, and it's atrocious, unfortunately. Yeah, it's a yikes moment, an oh my gosh moment. I didn't know our chart could go that high, actually. But yes, we ended up with 15,195 million records exposed in 2019. That's a 284% increase over last year, and close to double our all-time high from 2017.
Wow.
Hey, yeah, it is a wow.
It really is. And I don't want to move on from this. It's such an important point. But what is it that we mean by a record, and what's involved in that?
Yeah, excellent question. So with our schema, with our data, a record is a unique set of data points grouped together for processing. And that's sort of, our quoted, that's the standard of what we do. But what does that mean in reality? And it means that we can have something like an Excel spreadsheet. Maybe it's one file, but it has 1,000 rows in it as it pertains to 1,000 unique customers with data points about those customers across the rows. For us, that would be 1,000 records in our schema. But it does highlight, I think, the point that a record is not necessarily synonymous with the number of people impacted. And I think that's particularly important. Yeah, when we look at the largest breaches that were disclosed in 2019, at least so far, I think this is it. I think we're done with the big monsters. But when we look at our 4 largest breaches, coming right there at the top in November, an organization that has yet to be fully named leaked marketing profiles that were gathered and aggregated from multiple other companies. Companies like Oxydata, People Data Labs, a number of other sources have been all put together into a data set and accidentally made available or accessible online. But of those 4 billion records, multiple records would pertain to one person. So the number of people impacted in that event is closer to 1.2 billion. So still pretty bad, but not quite as bad as 4 billion. And we saw that trend with a breach out of China in July with an organization by the name of Orbivo. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, where 2 billion records were exposed. But again, important to keep in mind, those were log records. So those were transaction records with their customer base. Their total customer base, although we didn't have confirmation of what that is I'm sure something less than 2 billion folks. So interesting point to keep in mind when we're thinking about the total number of records exposed. But then again, on the flip side of that, in November, we did see a breach at an organization called Light in the Box, where 1.6 billion records were exposed, and that probably was a pretty close match with the number of people impacted by it. And the same thing with an event out of Estonia at an organization called Verifications.io, which was another marketing firm. What is it with this marketing stuff? Can you guys just not lock it down? What is it?
Yeah. We'll talk more about that when we get to passwords.
Just joking, folks. Just joking. But yet here we have, again, another example where we have marketing profiles aggregating data on multiple customers, 982 million of them to be precise, left open and accessible on an FTP server. So of that 15 billion plus records exposed, looking at about almost 7 billion, so almost a little less than half of them coming from 4 specific events, where we know the number of people impacted is something less than 15 billion, or less than 7 billion, I should say.
Hey, Inga, just before we move on, just a really quick question that's come in. I think the answer is actually probably quite clear from the last conversation, but for the sake of clarity, there's a question about the geographic nature of these stats. So are they truly global? Are they focused in any one country?
Yeah, it's a great question. So they are global statistics. We aggregate breach events from all over the world, wherever they happen, and they can be verified and validated as being true events that have taken place. One caveat to that, because I am a big proponent of always being clear about what's going on behind the data, is we do conduct our research primarily in English, so that does influence our results to a certain extent, I would say. So great question. Great question. All right, so let's dig into those numbers a little bit more, and let's look at breach types. So of course, for all these events, all these records exposed, we like to capture how the data actually went missing or ended up compromised. And as you can see, as far as pure number of events goes, hacking, which is our shorthand for unauthorized access to systems or services or data, that accounts for the lion's share of events that we saw in 2019. Actually, 5,184 of our 7,000 total came from that unauthorized access activity, far outweighing any other breach type that we track, and we track about 35 additional breach types. So hacking is taking the top spot in 2019.
Is that something you'd expect to see based on prior trends?
Yeah, actually it is, and I'm sorry to say that's not too surprising. Actually, right. Quarter after quarter, year after year for the past several years, hacking has been in the top spot. I did go back through the data to see at what point was it not in the number one position, and I think it was 2012 was the last year it didn't end up in the number one position. Yeah, so it's been that top spot for quite some time. But one thing that has shifted over the past few years is what accounts for the most number of records exposed. And while hacking, far outstripped any other breach type as far as the sheer volume of incidents, it is a distant second with regard to the number of records exposed. Now, it does still account for 1.5 billion records exposed, which is, hard to call that good. But when you compare that to what we call in our shorthand web or web exposure, which is largely inadvertent, although sometimes it's intentional, but putting data out there, making it accessible and available through the internet has been the most significant driver of records exposed, with over 13 billion records exposed in 2019. And that matches up nicely with plays into what I was saying a little bit earlier about our 4 largest breaches and their contribution to the total number of records. But
Inga, we've had a couple of good questions about the nature of hacking, and I'm going to hold one of them back for Q&A because I think it's quite a complicated one. But one here that we could just address. The question was, when we talk about hacking, would that include somebody sent an email and somebody's clicked on that, or would that be categorized differently?
That is an excellent question. So behind all of our major breach types, we do track varieties as well. So in that particular description, as a first step in the chain, we would categorize that as a social engineering phishing for getting access into the system. Now, if they actually used stolen credentials or took the data that they were able to gain from that a little bit further, then that would be classified as hacking. And we'll talk about that as some of our other charts come up in the discussion. So keep that in mind, and we'll touch on that a little bit more. Great question.
Yeah, and I'll just say there are at least 2 more questions about hacking. I am going to come back to those in the Q&A section, so I will allow you to keep going for now, Inga. But we for those who ask those questions, do stick around. We'll get to you.
Hey, fantastic. So with that said, one of my favorite charts to look at quarter after quarter, year after year, is I love to look at insider activity versus outsider activity and how that breaks down for breach events. And because I find it a little bit interesting to watch the talk around, the insider threat and how bad is the insider threat. And I do think the distinction, or I do think what happens here is a little more nuanced. As we can see, over 6,000 of our breach events originated from outside the organization. So that would be those malicious actors, trying to break into the system, somebody external to the company doing something that resulted in the unauthorized access or the unauthorized disclosure of the information. Only 840 of our events originated from inside the organization. And if we break those down a little bit further to look at whether those were accidental or malicious insiders that were responsible for those, of course, we can't determine motivation for all of these folks, but accidental exposure far outweighs the malicious insider activity. And we can see we had 574 of those 840 events were just straight up mistakes, whether it's the user making a mistake, like falling for a phishing email and sending W-2s off to who knows whom, posing as the CFO, that sort of thing, all the way through to those big misconfiguration boo-boos where servers full of data, databases, backups, and that sort of thing are sitting open and unprotected or behind a default password. So that sorts of insider mistakes are the vast majority. Although of our malicious insiders, of our 117, I always like to dig a little deeper into those, and 31 of those events I would view as incredibly threatening to an organization. 31 events impacted intellectual property directly. And by that I mean it was the theft of new technologies, of novel drug research, of proprietary manufacturing processes. Even the development of autonomous vehicle technology was implicated in one event as well. So when we look at that insider malicious activity, and especially when it's targeting intellectual property, I think that's when we see the type of events that can produce a truly existential threat to the organization. So even though those malicious insiders are a small piece of it, some of the damage that they can do is quite exceptional. And that's something that we've seen fairly consistently over the last few years as well. So lock down your IP tightly. If you're thinking about, information classification systems, put IP at the very top of the list. Like, obviously, but yeah. But all that said, we do have, I think, a little bit of good news that I want to hit on here, and that is the confidentiality impact of these events. So, not all data breach events are created the same. Certainly you have something like an Equifax breach where you have malicious actors inside your system stealing loads and loads of data for a long time. That's pretty catastrophic. and not quite on par with somebody who accidentally left their laptop behind in a restaurant. Both could be both are breach events, potentially, if that laptop had sensitive information and wasn't protected in any way, shape, or form. You've lost control of it, that's, you got data at risk. But we look at those different types of events, and we classify them as confirmed unauthorized access to data versus a potential exposure, potential unauthorized access to the data. And 77% of our events came in on the confirmed side, while 23% came in on the potential side. And that actually is a bit of a shift from what we've seen in prior years and prior quarters. Usually the confirmed is more in the mid to low 80s, and potential is in the mid to high teens. So the numbers are coming down a little bit on the potential side. And now I do want to say, I think the reason for this, and what's going on behind the scenes here, is just the sheer volume of unauthorized access to users' email systems. I touched on that a little bit at the outset of our talk today. But the way we're seeing that actually play out in the numbers is that what we're seeing is that the impacted organization, they discover that somebody has gotten in to the email system, usually through phishing, unfortunately, but have had access to all the emails flowing back and forth in and out of that particular user's account. Why attackers would want to do that? There's a myriad of reasons that motivate that, but it can kick off an incredibly painful response and remediation process. And in fact, if you download the report, we highlight one organization in particular, just the steps and the time and the work that went through understanding actually what was happening. But how that plays out then with the breach reports and with our statistics is when we're reading the summaries and the reports that come out on the incident, quite often in this particular incident type, we see where the organization says, hey, we know somebody was in the system. We know that there was confidential information flowing through the system, but we have no way of knowing if that information was actually accessed by the attackers or not. So a lot of unstructured data floating around out there, which makes for, I think, a pretty messy cleanup. So that's interesting.
Before you move on, I'm super excited to get to the next piece, but there is a question. I think it's a really quick and easy one, but it is a really good statistical question. And I'm not sure if it was for this slide or the previous one, but the question is, what type of instance would the unknown portion include?
That is a great question, actually.
It is, isn't it?
So
philosophical.
It is. So we don't guess is my answer. We do always allow for key data fields that we track, which would be things like breach type, number of records exposed, inside versus outside, that sort of thing. We do allow an option for unknown when the data is either conflicting or there simply is no reliable data available to properly categorize that piece of data, that particular data point. So unknown would be anything from we completely sweep it under the rug, we refuse to say anything other than we had a cybersecurity incident and we and we know data was lost from that. So that doesn't really tell us all that much. All the way through to other types of things where it's just not clear or a little bit nebulous. That makes sense?
It does to me. Thank you very much.
All right, fantastic. Well, then let's move forward and let's talk a little bit about ransomware and take a little bit of a closer look about how that played out in 2019. So as I mentioned, we track subsets of data behind our breach types as well. And one of the things that we look at is malware events and when ransomware is included. And ransomware has been particularly nasty in the public entity space, healthcare space, schools. They've had a really, really rough time with ransomware this year. In fact, we had 316 of our breach events also included an element of ransomware in with it as well. And that is one of the more interesting developments that we saw towards the end of 2019 is sort of the evolution and the merging conceptually of a breach and a ransomware or encryption type of event. I think 18 months ago, we're pretty safe in saying, the two may be two different things. But with recent developments at organizations or groups like the Maze Group, Reveal Group, NIMT, BitPaylock, they're starting to incorporate download or the ability to download data or exfiltrate data in with their ransomware as well. So either concurrent with launching the encryption or just before they launch the encryption, they might, they have been, I would say, taking bits and pieces of data as both proof of concept that they were in your system, but then also to leverage and ratchet up the pressure to get organizations to pay, holding over that threat of we're going to release your data. So of course we were very curious about this. We have seen in the past organizations or groups have made threats like that. I only could think of one specific example where they actually went forward with that threat. It didn't seem to be a very consistent practice. But now with some of the changes at some of these groups, Maze Group in particular does make accessible evidence of what they have taken from their clients, and I do clients in air quotes. But they do have a site set up where our researcher was able to go and take a closer look at what was being offered as evidence or proof that they were in the system and that they did exfiltrate data. And we saw quite a variety of information being shared. There was a warehousing and transportation firm. What we saw in those files was just mostly IP addresses, computer names, some country codes associated with it. Almost was actual evidence that they were inside the network. But then as we moved through the data, we saw things like a commercial roofer who the same type of data was being shared. But then there were some back-end files that made us think, yeah, nobody's getting that unless they had some level of access into the network. A little hard to discern from what we were able to see how deep that access went, but enough so that I would say, yes, they were inside. We don't enough seen to know that we've got trouble there. And then, of course, one of the most public examples that came out right at the very end of 2019 was the city of Pensacola, Florida, who disclosed the events themselves. And we could see files from various departments from the city, everything from the clerk, the sanitation, risk management, legal, finance. The list went on and on and on. As very, I think, legitimate or valid proof that data had been exfiltrated first. So that is a trend that we're seeing, or a turn in ransomware that we have not seen on this scale, certainly in the past. And that's setting up for a pretty scary outlook, I think, for 2020 as we go in there. So, with that said, let's keep that conversation going. And let's look at a little bit of bonus content here for the data types exposed in our 7,000 events. As you can see, passwords and email addresses came in right at the top of the list. So access credentials, very popular. They've been very popular for a long time. They continue to be extremely popular data types to go after. All the way down to intellectual property. But it certainly does, I think, bring up an interesting opportunity for analysis. So part of what we do here at Risk-Based Security is gather up leaked credentials. We decided for the 2019 report that we wanted to do a little bit of analysis of password security, taking a look at the Zynga breach in particular. And just as a quick reminder to our listeners, Zynga in September of 2019 it was disclosed that they had been compromised by Gnostic players, I do believe. Total number of records exposed have been floated around out there at about 200 million, but when you actually dedupe it and take out things that were like test@test.com, looking at probably something like 170, 180 million records. We took a subset of that data, 25 million records, and asked a few questions about password security for Words with Friends users. And a lot of good firms have done a lot of password analysis in the past, so we didn't want to repeat that, but we did want to ask a few questions of the security. Not surprising, I suppose, but perhaps a little disappointing, password is still the #1 password for folks to use to get into their Words with Friends accounts. Of course, we saw all sorts of number patterns coming up, not too surprising, keyboard patterns with QWERTY. I like number 6, words. Why not use the name of the service you're accessing?
That's ironic.
As your password.
I do want to offer some praise. At least for the second most popular there, they have used a 9-digit password. So, you know,
true. They did get up to the length, absolutely. Yeah. And I also like number 10, change me. Apparently they didn't follow through. No. Lots of folks forgetting their Words with Friends passwords. But anyway, that said, we did ask a few more detailed questions about that password security. So one of the things that we looked at is, well, of our set of 25 that we were analyzing, how many were all lowercase, how many were a mixture of upper and lowercase, and how many were purely numbers? And we can see that at least 60% of the passwords were a mix of upper and lowercase letters. So hey, that's something. So we decided to take it a little bit further, and we set out 6 different attributes that we would say are important to password security. So things like 8 characters or more, and yes, we went with 8 characters because, come on, this is Words with Friends. We've got to cut them some slack, but 8 characters or more, uppercase letters, lowercase letters, a number, a symbol, and then not containing a substring of the user's name or the site being accessed, like words as your password for Words with Friends. So we came up with our 6 attributes. We scored each one evenly and then asked the question, who's more secure, Gmail users or AOL users? And we ranked them all out there. And on a 6-point scale, 3.33 would be average security. And we can see that Gmail users came in slightly more secure passwords than, say, AOL users who brought up the bottom of the barrel. But all that said, not every attribute of those 6 attributes is necessarily equal. So we did a little bit of weighting based on our own opinions of which we think might be a little bit more important for creating a more secure password. And then we tested our average scores again, and we can see that still Gmail users came out on top. Yahoo slipped down just a little bit below our average. All the domains together came in right around average, with Hotmail and AOL coming in at the bottom. So
I am sure there are going to be a lot of AOL users on this call today who are very disappointed to be down the bottom of that list.
Potentially. But do download that report. There's a lot more password security analysis in there. We took a closer look at like military domains, government domains, and we had some fun with it. So pick it up and check it out. It's worth perusing for sure. But
absolutely.
We do need to move on in the
I just wanted to confirm as you talk about it. Yeah, so we have had some people asking, are these slides shared after? I do want to stress the report itself has lots and lots of these same charts and further analysis. So do download the report, and I think these slides are available on the BrightTalk platform as well.
All right. So, with that said, let's turn our attention to who was actually compromised in 2019. And we classify organizations through a number of different attributes. But the one that I like the most and one that's most popular is using the North American classification system, or NAICS system. And there's another letter in there that I'm missing. But it takes industry as a whole, breaks it down into a number of different economic sectors. And we can see that the organizations that were most compromised, according to economic sector, were ones that fell into the information sector. And if you're familiar with the NAICS groupings, that might be a little bit surprising because information is where you find things like movie producers and broadcasters and newspaper publishers. Not exactly the type of organizations that you might think of as being prime targets for losing sensitive data. But there are 3 specific subgroups in there that drove almost all of the activity in the information classification. Those are software developers, whether hosted or on-prem, web services, like hosting services, and then websites themselves. Those 3 very specific subgroups drove almost all of the data breach events that fall within the economic sector. So,
Inga, this might be naive, so please put me right. But when I look at this list, a couple of them stand out, including healthcare and finance and insurance, just because of the sort of the information that they carry. So should I be more alarmed by those, or does it not necessarily matter so much?
Well, that's a great question. And it's it's something that we talk about a lot on the research team. And it's important to keep in mind that we're talking about the classification for the organization itself, and not necessarily the type of data that went missing. I think the classification is interesting, but whether one should raise more alarm than the other, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think it's always important to take a step further down that road and look at what did those organizations actually lose. Now, obviously, if we're talking healthcare, there's a really good chance that medical data was lost or healthcare data was lost. But obviously, but if you think about it, big hospitals, they have lots of employees. They can lose lots of employee data as well. That doesn't really touch on treatment at all. Or likewise, if you have a billing system within a hospital compromised, that could be name, address, and insurance information. So it doesn't necessarily mean that with a healthcare breach that we're automatically talking about medical data being lost. There's more information in the report about that as well.
Thank you.
So I know we are getting close on time, and I do want to leave time for questions at the end. So one last nerdy chart to talk about, because it's another area that I love to track, and that is third-party incidents. So not only do we track who was the organization that was directly responsible for the loss of control over the sensitive data, but if they were holding data of other organizations, we call that a third-party breach. So, classic example of that, you got a payment processor, maybe the payment processor gets popped and it impacts transactions of hundreds of their customers that are, putting their credit card transactions through that payment processing system. So one way to think about this is cloud service providers. You could think about it that way. There's more in here than just cloud service providers, although a lot of the activity is driven by that type of service provider. And what we did see between 2018 and 2019 is the number of breaches actually grew quite a bit in 2019 for that third-party impact, whereas the number of records exposed pretty much matches that. 4 billion, that's a big number. But if you put that chart of number of records exposed right next to the same chart of the total data set, they look very much the same. If you took the number of third-party breaches and took that chart and put it next to the total data set of all breaches in 2019, you can see there's a much bigger increase in third-party breaches in this particular subset than we see in the data set as a whole. And I think that's an interesting trend that we need to keep an eye on going into 2020.
Is there anything different about the data in third-party incident breaches?
Oh, well, yes, there is a little bit. When we dig a little deeper into what's included in those third-party breaches, we tend to see what I think of in my own mind as more valuable fixed data being compromised, or data that's going to be much harder it's going to be much harder to manage and can be used for fraudulent purposes. So that's going to be things like your name, address, social security or social insurance number, dates of birth, driver's license numbers, things like that that are great information to have for full-on hardcore identity theft purposes, and data that it makes for a much bigger mess to clean up afterwards as well. So another aspect of third-party breaches that I think make them a little more concerning than the ordinary run-of-the-mill. Good question. So with that, let's talk real quickly about what to expect in 2020. I do think phishing for access credentials and email compromise is going to be with us for some time to come. It's just too easy to do, and it's too successful. So until we get a little bit better at stopping some of that phishing that's going on, I think we're going to continue to see that into 2020. I think ransomware is going to get even worse as we go into the next year. I really wish that was not the truth, but just based on what we saw as 2019 unfolded and what we're seeing happening right now today, I think ransomware is going to be an even bigger headache into the next decade. And then, of course, I've got to say, again, getting back to the total number of records lost, all coming from misconfigured servers and out there. Searching the internet for internet-connected devices really is fun. I've done a little bit of this myself, and it's a little bit like it's a little bit like an Easter egg hunt. And it's security researchers like doing it, and malicious actors it's low-hanging fruit for them as well. So with the proliferation of search options for looking for internet-connected devices, I don't see data leaking or data leakage going away anytime soon either. So with that, I know we still have a few minutes for questions. I did want to mention real quickly that this data and so much more is a product of Cyber Risk Analytics. It is, I know I'm biased, but it is the standard for data breach intelligence and third-party risk ratings. So, don't want to find your vendor in there as the unfortunate victim of a third-party breach or having suffered a breach. But Cyber Risk Analytics is great for uncovering that type of information and quite a bit more about that vendor network. So everything that you see here, if you're interested in learning more, check out cyberriskanalytics.com or ping us directly. So with that, Brendan, I think you had a few questions for me.
Oh, I sure do. Let me very quickly, because I know a few people will drop off, thank everyone for joining us today. It's been a really interesting and insightful session. I really enjoyed it, Inga. So thank you for your work and for the work of your research team. I will just say we really welcome feedback in the tool. So please, if you've enjoyed this session, go ahead and give us some stars. I'd appreciate that very much. Do subscribe to our channel. We will see you next time with a focus on vulnerability research. So looking forward to that. But first, let's take a look at some of the questions we've had. And Inga, in each of these cases, you may want to answer it, or you might want to say, throw it on the backlog for a white paper. we will develop deeper research into these. Two topics that are very, very similar. Both about cloud providers. So how many inside threats have occurred within cloud providers, and also how many hacks or other security stats can we share? I know we don't have those stats immediately to hand, so I guess I'm interested to know, are they within Cyber Risk Analytics?
So yeah, I would say they're within. It can be pulled out of Cyber Risk Analytics, and it's something for us to think about for our next report. As well. But yes, we do classify. When we talk about classification of organizations, we track them all the way down to the full six-figure NAICS code, which does allow you to focus in quite closely on those software service providers. So you can see a bit more closely who exactly is having a breach. And then once you have that data set in hand, there is all sorts of analysis that we can do on it, whether it's insider, outsider, records lost, how it happened, all that good information can be derived from there.
Yeah, fantastic. I will just say we did also get a really interesting question breaking down hacking data given the revelation about China and Equifax. So I think that's a huge topic that we do not have time to address right now. But I'm going to take a look at it from a content perspective and see what we could do in terms of answering that on our blog. So do check out riskbasedsecurity.com in the future. And
if I have 30 seconds for a quick soapbox, attribution is really difficult. Always look at attribution be jaded when you look at attribution. It can be true, but it can just as easily not be true. Attribution is incredibly difficult.
Sure is. Well, that takes us to the end of today's session. Again, please do leave your feedback. Thank you very much for joining us. And Inga, I just want to thank you for the work of you and your team today. It's been a really useful and informative session. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Goodbye, everyone.